Go.
This is Michael Smook for U2 Commentaries. Today is September 23rd. It's a Friday, and we're in the year 2016. The topic of today's conversation is politics and governing in the American system, past, present, and future. We're going to talk briefly about the presidential race and determine among the candidates who's for change. Is it radical change, incremental change, or the status quo? In addition, we're going to talk about the need in the United States for an infrastructure rebuilding process whereby we can strengthen the middle class and expand it. And the reason why I've decided to have this conversation with you today, because I think it's important to look back on past presidencies, Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan, and take their effective governmental approach, that's Johnson, and Reagan's capital, private sector approach, and insert that into an infrastructure rebuilding process whereby we can learn from the past, take the programs that worked in the past, and be aware of what didn't work in the past, so we can make steps together, cross the ideological divide, and bridge Democrats with Republicans, liberals and conservatives all working together, as well as independents, and we could move forward together. The second reason why I feel this conversation is necessary stems from the fact that I believe America is already great. However, we still have work to do. And before I go forward with this conversation, there are some other things I wanted to talk to you about. Many people are very frustrated with the American system. And in the last year and a half, we've had a long-distance presidential race. And American people are frustrated by gridlock. And the thing is that the system was designed to not be as efficient as it should be, because the way the Founding Fathers designed the Constitution, and they wanted cool heads to prevail, and that both branches of the House of the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate needed to be in sync with each other, and then they needed to work with the president. So things are not moving as quickly as we'd like, and sometimes we get a little bit frustrated with it because that's how the system was designed to be. The second thing is that everybody in this country, just about everybody, has struggled. Black, white, brown, red, straight, gay, transgender, everybody has struggled in this country. People have to fight for their rights. American history is unpleasant, and if you want to take an unvarnished look at American history and the way the system is today, it's going to be an ongoing struggle, and sometimes it's not going to be pleasant. But at the end of the day, I'm still optimistic. And I go back to the words of one of our founding fathers, James Madison, who said in Federalist Paper number 45, he said, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. Well, men and women are not angels, so at the end of the day, government is our last best hope to find the progress and have a better society where we have equity, opportunity, and justice for as many folks as possible. So now that said, I want to talk to you about the two most transformational presidencies in the last 55 years. And it's really interesting because we're talking about Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat and a liberal, and who looked for inspiration from Franklin Roosevelt. And on the other hand, you had Ronald Reagan, who was once a Democrat and a liberal, and then sometime in the 1940s he changed. He became Republican and conservative, and he looked back to Calvin Coolidge for inspiration, a Republican president from the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge said, "The business of America is business." So what's fascinating about these two men is they had different approaches to running the country as chief executive. They had many successes, and they also had some setbacks as well. And the reason why we're talking about them now, not just because it's interesting history, but because we're going to take this conversation, this part of the conversation, and then we're going to insert it into some ideas I have about what the United States can do to re-energize the economy through an infrastructure rebuilding process. Now, quickly about Johnson. He became president on November 22nd, 1963. John Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The country was in deep shock. And Johnson took Kennedy's agenda, and inspired by his previous work with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he introduced a massive, robust domestic program called the Great Society Program. Some people call it the War on Poverty. I can think of 6 programs that are still in place now because Johnson put them through. Medicaid and Medicare, insurance to cover. He couldn't get universal health care, but he got coverage to cover poor people and also seniors. And down the road, after Johnson left office, a lot of senior citizens spend down their wealth getting into nursing homes, and Medicaid, these were Medicare patients, but Medicaid covered long-term care. So now Medicaid also covers for middle-class people who are seniors, and it's expanded to cover them that. Johnson couldn't get everything he wanted. He wanted universal health care, but he basically was able to accomplish a lot in terms of health care insurance. And then 45 years later, Barack Obama, it's like a football game. He took the handoff and ran down the field for a touchdown. In addition, Johnson we have a terrible history. Slavery was for hundreds of years. We had a terrible civil war. Many Americans, North and South, were killed. Millions of people of color were enslaved. And then after the Civil War for 12 years, after Reconstruction, the North pulled the troops out of the South, and people of color exchanged illegal and political slavery for economic slavery. They were now tenant farmers on the same plantations they worked, and there were extra legal messages to hang people without trial. A vigilante group called the Ku Klux Klan took over. So the United States for nearly 90 years, especially in the South, but also in other parts of the country, civil rights were put on hold. So what Johnson was able to get approved through Congress were the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is just a first step, and here we are 50 plus years later. We're still having the same conversations. Sometimes we're having arguments. So Johnson it was a good first step. It was a start. The problems we have in terms of race in this country still need to be worked out today. When you see disharmony in places like Baltimore and in Ferguson, Missouri, and I hear coworkers at work in New York City, many are people of color. They pay taxes, they're well educated, they go to church, but they feel that the system is not set up to provide them and to look after them. And they feel that there needs to be change in America. And then there are people who feel completely different. So I guess the point of it all is it's hard to find change, and it's hard to bring everybody along together. So a couple of more things about Johnson before we move on to Reagan. Johnson was able to get food stamp program approved, which covers between 40 and 50 million Americans. If people didn't have food stamp vouchers, there would be starvation and malnutrition. And these programs that were put in place over 50 years ago are a part of the federal government's benefits to those low-income people who can't afford to feed themselves. In addition, another program which is very popular and has been very successful stems from Head Start, and that provides children 3 through 5 who are approaching kindergarten, and it gives them remedial help in terms of classes, so they'll be ready for kindergarten. It involves the parents, and it also involves nutrition programs. So what I've just outlined are 6 programs regarding health insurance, civil rights and civil liberties, and other social programs like food stamps and Head Start. So the thing is that Johnson's legacy is robust in terms of domestic legislation. And in another sense, Johnson's legacy hasn't been continued. His legislation on environmental law, on immigration, on jobs programs, these have not stood the test of times. And by the time Ronald Reagan came along, 12 years after Johnson left office, these programs were history. And part of the reason stems from the fact that the president never, at the same time he launched a robust domestic agenda, he engaged the United States in an undeclared war in Southeast Asia, Vietnam. Between 500,000 and 600,000 Americans, men and women, were fighting over to save South Vietnam from a communist invasion. And Johnson never bonded with the American people over guns and butter at the same time. And so the thing is that Johnson's legacy Johnson did not run for re-election in 1968, and his legacy would have been cemented if he had another 4 years. And then within 12 years after he left office, a conservative Republican who believed in the free markets, who believed a dollar spent in the private sector was a better investment than a dollar spent on effective governmental action by what the Democrats had been proposing. So Reagan was 180 degrees from Johnson. Reagan believed that that we needed to do several things to get America going. First of all, he felt the Soviet Union was a threat to the United States, so we needed a large increase in our defense budgets. Also, when Reagan came into office, we had a terrible problem with inflation and unemployment. They were double-digit. Reagan cleverly, in the debates with Jimmy Carter, he referred these two negative economic statistics as the misery index. And he was effective in his debates with Carter, and he did well in the debates, and he had approaching a landslide victory. And what he was able to do is get what he wanted: massive tax cuts, which helped middle class and low income people, but it greatly affected in a positive way wealthy people and big companies. And over a period of time, the economy rebounded. And he also got his way. He felt that executive agencies that were assigned to regulate private industry were actually stifling the economic engine of the free market in the United States. So just one example, he pulled back the bank regulators from being aggressive in terms of regulating our financial services institutions. And so in a sense, Reagan was successful, not only the economic growth, but toward the end of his administration and the next administration, because of his military buildup, the Soviet Union literally disintegrated. And what the major nation that came into being after that was the country of Russia. They kept the nuclear weapons, although they were in a weakened economic state. So Republicans believe that Reagan's free market approach was very successful. He has a near iconic status, at least among Republicans. And the negative aspects are, in order to fuel cutting inflation in half and putting many millions of Americans back to work, the price we had to pay for putting back people to work was we tripled the national deficit. Now, that may not affect people today or tomorrow, but that's the price we had to pay to put people back to work. And we pay interest on the debt, but for the foreseeable future, Reagan's ideas, Reagan's economic ideas, Reaganomics, are not going to pay the principal on the national debt. Also, after Reagan left office, his ideas about taking government off our backs and the regulators, what happened was 1 out of 3 banks, savings and loan banks, or near insolvency. So what his successor, George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st president of the United States, what he did was he and his successor, Bill Clinton, had to go to Congress, and it cost us, the taxpayers, $160 billion to bail out the savings and loans. So let's just summarize briefly and then move on. Johnson and Reagan had two completely different approaches. Johnson was the effective governmental action, and he was successful in many ways. And Reagan was the economic engine of the United States, is going to bring prosperity to the country, and all we need is tax cuts, less regulation, and government then needs to get out of the way and then let the economy perform its magic. So they had both completely different perspectives. They had many successes, but they came short. So shortly we're going to talk a little bit about how we can take some of the enthusiasm and the feelings and maybe some specific policies and then graft that onto an infrastructure rebuilding process so we can put America to work. Briefly, let's just talk about the present president, Barack Obama, and the presidential race between the Republican, Donald Trump, and the Democrat, Hillary Clinton. We're going to speak briefly about it, but there are a couple of points I want to make before we move on. Barack Obama came into office, the country was in a recession, and we could have had a depression. And so actually the previous administration, George Bush and the Secretary of Treasury, were able to get somewhere between $700 and $800 billion appropriated by a Republican Congress. And they weren't happy about it, but they came up with the money. And then Obama was elected, and his Secretary of Treasury, Tim Geithner, and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, they all worked together, and they loaned the money to the banks, and the banks a couple of years later actually repaid all that money with $26 billion of interest. But this saved a run on the banks, and it gave a chance, and there was new legislation as well to prevent the banks from making the same mistakes in the future. A couple of things about Obama. During his presidency, unemployment has been cut in half. The growth of the national debt has been cut in half annually. Inflation is low. Wall Street is well. The dollar is strong. And there's a long list of either legislation that has been approved by Congress, or when Obama no longer had a Democrat Congress, and he had to rule by executive action, at least for the remainder of his presidency, that'll be in place. So what about Barack Obama? Is he a bad president, a good president, or is he a great president? Well, I would say it's fairly safe to say he's a good president. And as far as whether he's going to be a very good president, an excellent president, or a great president, that all depends. If a candidate is elected, and I'm thinking the Democrat is elected, and Hillary Clinton is able to take the Obama agenda and pass the authorization and the appropriation legislation, and then public administrators and the private sector all working together within the United States. There's teamwork and there's communication within our country, and we also reach out to our allies and our competitors. We're going to be a success in terms of the Paris Climate Accord or the Iran nuclear agreement. We'll put a stop or greatly retard global warming, and we'll keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of Iran. So with Barack Obama, I have a good feeling about him. He's at minimum a good candidate. In terms of whether he's going to be he was a good president rather, he is a good president rather, but is he going to be an excellent president? It all depends. Time will tell. In terms of, now let's move on. In terms of the two candidates for President of the United States, are they candidates for change? Briefly, Donald Trump, in some ways, is a candidate for radical change. He wants to slap tariffs against Chinese imports. He wants to build a wall with Mexico, which might interfere with our trade with Mexico. He wants to perhaps scuttle the North American Free Trade Agreement. He wants to deport between 11 and 12 million undocumented residents. If he gets his wish and all of these things happen, it's a radical change. But I have yet to be convinced it's good change. I'm hopeful I'm wrong and he's right if he's elected. But I think the United States could easily slide into a recession or a depression. In terms of what else is he for? Well, it's a big question mark. He basically wants to roll back just about everything Obama has done, and it's hard to say what he's going to replace it with. So I put a big question mark over Barack Obama. In terms of some of his other policies, it's the standard Republican line. He wants massive tax cuts, which are really going to affect positively big businesses and rich people. And he also wants to rearm the military, even though I'm not really sure what he wants to do with it, except maybe invade Syria. So in a sense that Obama is advocating policies that are status quo that were advocated by Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush. So Hillary Clinton, I was watching about her. I was watching the other day, I was watching CNN and Wolf Blitzer is on. And what happened was Blitzer is comparing Hillary to Bernie Sanders, who wanted to break up the banks. Hillary doesn't want to do that. She wants to expedite. She wants to take her time compared to Bernie raising the federal minimum wage. Bernie wants it overnight to be at a certain level, and Hillary wants to do it over a staggered period of time. And so on. And she basically goes down through Bernie's agenda and compares Hillary as being a more aligning closer to Bernie Sanders, but taking a more pedestrian pace. But the way I look at it is Hillary's probably trying to figure out, how do we pay for all this stuff? Bernie Sanders never particularly explained how with all the wonderful things that he wanted to do, how we're going to pay for it. In terms of Hillary, if she doesn't introduce anything new, if she merely takes Obama's agenda, and let's just take one policy, if she decides that it's a major priority for the United States to be compliant with the Paris Climate Accord, it's going to require additional authorization legislation by Congress. It's going to require funding. It's going to require teamwork and communication between different agencies that make up the federal government, between different levels of government, federal, state, and local. The government's going to have to interface, connect with private industry within this country, and we're also going to have to reach out to our allies and our adversaries who we still need to work with, like the Chinese. So in a sense, you could say, well, Hillary's just for incremental change because she's just taking Obama's agenda and she just wants to take what he's done. But these are not self-executing policies. It's going to require the best and the brightest we have in this country working full-time, because let's face it, global warming is huge, and we still don't really know what level of activity and energy and funding we need to be successful. So I think that if she's elected president and then she goes ahead and she's successful, and I'm just taking one of many policies that Obama has put out there, that's going to be a tremendous achievement. So it's not radical, it's not incremental, it's not the status quo. There's only one word for it. It's very important. And we might need to spend billions now to save trillions later. And only history will know what she did and what she overcame if she is elected president. And right now it's going to be a close race, and we're not really sure how it's going to come out. Let's move on now to some thoughts I have about an infrastructure rebuilding process. I think that what the United States needs to do is we need to start small. We need a well thought out plan. And there's an old saying, success breeds success. I think the American people would like to see money spent on infrastructure rebuilding processes, including rebuilding roads and bridges, pulling out lead-laced pipes in places like Flint, Michigan, where we're poisoning our kids. Those are just 3 examples of many examples, but I think the American people would like to see the federal government become successful. If the federal government is successful, and let's start small. We start small, we take corrective measures during a project, and then we develop best practices. American people, if they see that their tax dollars are being well spent, and they see that we're being successful in rebuilding the country, people are going to start to get really excited about it. They'll see that government works. You see, what happens is 70 and 80 years ago, Franklin Roosevelt, during the New Deal, what he was doing, he was engaging in processes whereby we can build the Hoover Dam. We could create the Tennessee Valley Authority. This created low-cost electricity to people throughout the country, and it put people to work with jobs. And those people, even though the government had to pay money to build these things, people were put to work. There were jobs. People were paying taxes with those jobs, and then we're rebuilding things that are going to last 50 to 100 years. And so I think that if the American people see that their tax dollars are going well, are being well spent, people won't mind paying their taxes. Because I think what we need to do is this. I think we could borrow, people will develop confidence that government works. And I also think that that's why I'm talking about Johnson and Reagan. I think that if we reach a point where we have pilot projects, corrective actions, best practices, and people start to develop confidence that government works, then we could do some robust planning. And, chance favors the well-prepared plan. To borrow from Louis Pasteur and change that quote just a little bit, I think that what we could do then, a couple of years into a new administration, is start to develop a roadmap, robust plans. Maybe at some point, for some forms of infrastructure, whether it's mass transportation, it's renewable sources of energy, it's a GI Bill to get our kids through college, public colleges, and it could be a number of areas that are infrastructure. We have a robust plan of different kinds of infrastructure that need to be built, trillions and trillions of dollars, could be over years, could be over several decades. But I think if we plan big and we decide what role should government play, should the federal government take the lead? Should it be delegated to the states or the local government? Also, in some cases, it may be best if the federal government passes the laws, but it's carried out by the private sector. Maybe we do competitive sealed bids, and we get the best contractors, the best product at an affordable cost, and we let the private sector do it. The federal government will be monitoring, auditing it. They'll be ensuring environmental regulations are in place. So I think that if we have a robust plan, but we're flexible, and we sometimes, like Johnson, believe that effective governmental action is the remedy. At other times, maybe government could help jumpstart things, but then hand it over to the private sector, and they can rebuild on certain projects as well. So I think we need to channel Johnson and Reagan. I think that they were both successful for different reasons, and I think that maybe they tried too hard. Johnson tried too hard at effective governmental action. Reagan relied too much on the private sector, but that doesn't diminish what they did. There's no book you read to becoming president, and it's not an easy process. All we can do is think about what George Santayana once said. He said that those who don't learn from the past are destined to repeat it in the future. the really tricky thing about what Santayana said, although it resonates inside me, the really tricky part is when you look at history, what factors are key? What factors are relevant or irrelevant? And also, things change. People's expectations change. Everything changes. So it's really hard to know what's the next best step to do. And that's why we all sort of need to be patient. And I think we could create win-win situations by thinking small, pilot projects, corrective actions, and then we develop best practices. Then we could go robust in terms of planning and then implementing projects. And then we do these projects, we either government takes the lead or the private sector takes the lead, but the government is still involved as sort of like a co-pilot. So I've basically, without telling you, I'm going to summarize. I've basically summarized my approach for what America needs to do. And let me just part now with you and say this is Michael Smook for YouTube Commentaries. Today is Friday, September 23rd. The year is 2016. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I'm excited about what's going on these days. On Monday, I'm going to watch the debates between Trump and Clinton. And I haven't been this excited since I watched the Kennedy-Nixon debates from 1960 this morning. I watch them all the time. I really admire both Richard Nixon and John Kennedy. Anyway, until next time, goodbye and good luck.